Hey folks, Segasonicfan here, and today I'm going to show you how to recap and repair, replenish, rejuvenate some Sega Game Gear soundboards. I've got this kind of crazy camera hack set up so I can talk and give an overhead view while I'm doing this. Hopefully this works out. I haven't tried this before. And I have here a bunch of Game Gear soundboards. And I'm going to show you how to do this kind of the professional way. A lot of people do this, I think, in a way that's not super professional and not their fault. It's just the information's not being spread far and wide, which is my attempt here. And people will oftentimes, they'll remove the old capacitors, put a little solder down, and put a new capacitor, and then just call it a day. What people don't understand, though, is that there is a lot of leaking electrolyte, which essentially functions as an acid that will decay and deteriorate your board long after you've replaced the capacitors. So it's really important that you clean the board thoroughly and get rid of all of that acid and leaking electrolyte, as well as reflow various components to make sure that you're going to have a board that's actually going to last a long time or be close to stock. Now in this video, I probably won't get to actually placing the new capacitors, but I want to focus mainly on the removing of the leaking acid and how to clean and do that properly. A few important things for this video. One is for some safety stuff. So this stuff is really toxic and not fun to work with. So first, make sure you have some gloves like this. Make sure you have a breathing mask. I have like a paint fume extractor breathing mask that I'll put on for the duration of this video. This is some isopropyl alcohol, very useful for cleaning. And I have it in like a dropper, which is also very useful. Some cotton swabs, like so, for the cleaning. And also important to have some ventilation where you are. I have a large window open next to me right now. So if you have all of those things in place, then you're ready to start cleaning some boards. I'm going to choose kind of the nastiest ones I can find, and I'd say these two are pretty good candidates. I was just working on one that was particularly nasty. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and start working on this one. Now, the iron that I have is a WESD 5.1. It's a reasonably good iron, and the important thing is you want something where you can adjust the temperature. It's pretty darn useful for stuff like this because you're going to want something that's pretty high temperature. I actually got mine set to about 780 degrees right now, and that's because you're actually going to be vaporizing some of this stuff. It doesn't sound very good, but there's also just not a lot of way to do this otherwise. I have not tried ultrasonic cleaners. I'm sure there's some things like that, but ultrasonic cleaners can be very expensive. And yeah, one of these days I'll get one for sure. But yeah, I think some of the lower ultrasonic cleaners run about $200 to $400. So not exactly within my budget for parts at the moment. But I'm going to go ahead and work on this board. I'm going to put on my mask so it'll be a little muffled when I talk. And we'll see how it's done. The other thing, real quick, you're going to need is some flux. And a flux dispenser is the best way to go for this. If you're doing it with other ways, you're going to have a much harder time. And so usually the first step I do is I go and I put flux, just a lot of flux, all over the individual pads. And we're going to be removing the pads, and we're going to be using the flux as a heating agent, essentially, to help us vaporize the leaking battery acid. I'm not wearing my mask right now because I'm not actually melting the stuff yet. But you can see the importance for ventilation and having a breathing mask because we're creating toxic fumes here. You want to be very mindful of proper ventilation and proper safety procedures. And ideally, you'd get a fume extractor for this as well. But right now, my window is large enough, and it's cold outside and warm in here, so it's going to be pulling the air out quite rapidly. But a carbon filter is also ideal. So now I'm going to go in here with my iron. And it can also help if you apply fresh solder at the same time. Also,
Another material that can be very helpful is desoldering wick, which is this. I might actually start with the wick this time, see what happens. Because the wick should be able to pull up a fair amount of nasty stuff. Yeah, you see all that coming up? Pretty gross. I have to clean my camera lens. Now keep in mind, you're gonna, very likely, some of these pads are gonna come up, and you're gonna have to just deal with that and recreate them later with fresh copper or a patch. There's nothing you could do about that. That just means the acid's corroded so much of the pad that there's almost nothing left, so it just comes up really easily when you use the desoldering braid. And it's just an unfortunate reality of the damage that these leaking capacitors have done over the years. And then every so often, of course, you need to cut off the desoldering braid that you've used already. I try to get the most use out of it as I can. Also helps if you do these boards together, just in one sitting, because you're creating all these bad fumes, and if you have to fumigate every time you do this work, it's annoying. I try to do them all in one sitting if I can. This board wasn't as bad as the last one I worked on. It's still pretty gross. I definitely do try to get this coil here as well. It gets pretty gross. And depending on the condition of these smaller resistors and capacitors, I believe those are 0805 packages. I will try to reflow those in most circumstances. The reflowing is important to create a good electrical connection, as well as it is to burn off the acid that's touched them. And so now I'm going to go in here with my alcohol and a Q-tip soaked in it, and you'll see how much this is going to pull up. Now some of that's going to be flux, but you see the dark brown? That's the acid. So the light brown is usually the flux, but the dark brown stuff is the nasty. The last one I cleaned, it was actually black. It was so gross. And you can see why it's so important to do this right, because otherwise this is just eating through the board all the time, slowly deteriorating your game gear. Yeah, that one's pretty bad. Woo. This is going pretty fast. I might have time to do the actual capacitors and stuff. We'll see. The other thing you can do is you can use a hot air gun to vaporize a fair amount of this, but you can only get it so hot before you start damaging the plastic. And this plastic here, the white plastic, is especially prone to melting. Doesn't have the same heat tolerance as stuff you find nowadays. Keeping in mind this was, what, 30 years ago? God, it's hard to believe the Game Gear's been around for 30 years. Makes me feel old. Now you'll see here on the top I actually left part of a pad. But look at that. Look at how much I'm picking up there. I'm going to go ahead and come back in here and remove that little bit. I don't think that's a pad. I mean, it's part of the old capacitor lead. There's another capacitor lead over here I'm going to get rid of. And there we go. This is already looking a lot better. But this just goes to show you, a lot of times you'll find people selling, recapped Game Gears for 30 bucks or 50 bucks or whatever it is. And if you're really doing a quality job like this, you can't charge that because it just takes too much time to do it properly. And nowadays, I've been doing video game modifications since the early 00s. It's about, I want to say 04, 05. Been doing video game modifications for people. And, it was not a popular business back then. I was one of the only ones doing it, recaps and stuff like that. Nowadays, it's so popular that you have just this cottage industry of people doing it, which is cool. But the downside of that is that you do have a lot of people just looking for the quick buck. And anything they can do to get the system to power on and sell it and flip it is all they care about. They don't care about the longevity of the repair. Where I actually do. I think it's very important. So, yeah, something to keep in mind if you're shopping around for modding or recap services. Try to go with people that have been around a while, that are part of the community, that have a vested interest in, video games as a hobby, but also just the video game community and the longevity of their repairs. It's pretty cool when I hear from people that I've done repairs or upgrades for that are still playing the systems, gosh, like 10, 15 years later. I check up with people every once in a while. Sometimes I'll do an upgrade or repair for a friend, and I'll go, how's that going? And they'll be like, yeah, it's great, still working, That's always nice. And if you look on the bottom here, it's not too bad, though sometimes I do like to reflow some of those connectors. Now, again, with the temperature control soldering iron, you want to lower the temperature if you're going to reflow there, because, again, these connectors are not very heat resistant. Now, I'm pretty happy with that. I'm going to do one more pass with the cotton swab. But I've gotten a lot of it out there. You want to get to the point where you're just not picking up very much of that brown or black stuff when you go over with the swab. A little tiny bit is okay, especially if you're going over the whole board like this. And that's still kind of a lot. But yeah, maybe one more pass through. And like I said, some of that's going to be flux. And the flux is okay. The flux is not going to eat away at your board. It's the acid that we're worried about. That's pretty good. That's still picking up a lot, but it's not acid. It's just flux at this point. And I mean, look at how nice that is. That's how a board should look before you place new capacitors on there. Look at how beautiful. Now let's see if I have time. I think I do. I'm going to go ahead and recap some of these. I'll do a couple just to show you how I do it. People have different ways of doing it.
Take off my mask now that I finished the fumigating part of it. And I'm going to go ahead and put on the nice thing about these boards is they're only 47 microfarad and 100 microfarad caps. And I actually go ahead and I highly recommend you do the same, is actually investing in some nice surface mount, high quality surface mount capacitors. These are decent name brand, Panasonic caps right here. These are the hundreds or the 47s that I'm looking at. I think these are the 47s. The writing on these is so tiny. And, some of these are rated at 16 volts. I'm not sure how necessary that is. I went ahead and bought the 16 volts anyways, but keep in mind the Game Gear is a 5-volt system, and this particular audio amp is not, as far as I know, I don't think it's doing any split rail operation type stuff. And I mean, I guess even if it was, it still wouldn't matter. Just pulling out capacitors off camera, not very exciting right now. Stick with me. These are my 100s. Had to use my magnifying glass to look at the writing on the capacitors, because the stuff is so small nowadays. So I'm actually going to start with the 40. I usually start with the 47 that's way on the inside, because that sucker is it's hard to reach. And then I'm going to do the hundreds. Now, the other thing too you want to make sure of is if you see a lot of corrosion on this pin or over here, if you see this one just destroyed, you're really going to want to pay special attention to the jacks as well, because that means the acid leaked all the way under the jacks, and you'd be kind of amazed sometimes what you see under there. And that's when you have to, take your, like I said, take your iron to a lower temperature to try to refill the bottom. But a lot of times you actually have to take out the whole jack, or sometimes. When a repair gets that intense, sometimes I just kind of might actually wait, get a new board, or wait for a failure state, or I don't know. It kind of depends on, how deep you want to go. Sometimes that one, that might be just kind of do what you can. But when you get to the point where you're having to remove a bunch of parts, that's a pretty intense repair. If someone's paying, top dollar, sure, I'll do it. But that is one corner I might cut just a little bit. I don't cut corners hardly ever, but man, yeah, having to remove that jack and then clean the electrolyte under there can be nasty. A lot of times if a board's that bad, I'll just have to pitch it. So yeah, here's a nice 47. What I usually do when I go in here is I'll tin one of the pads. This is weird to do under the camera here. A little tricky. I'm actually going to go in and tin this pad right here. And you see how nicely that tinned? Look at that. No acid anywhere. I'm going to use my finer tip iron right now because that's going to help a little bit with this. Finer tip iron, by the way, is a, what is this? I can't reach the model number right now. Anyway, it's expensive. It's expensive, folks. I know a lot of people use the Hackos, though. Those are nice. I need to get one at some point. They've got some nice, affordable options nowadays. I think it was, gosh, who was the person that was talking about irons a lot? One of these retro modern dudes. So yeah, just go in here like so. And you don't need a super fine tipped iron. It just helps make the work a little bit faster, a little bit easier. And then expose the, sorry, it's a little bit off camera. Just kind of move the guy till the other pad's a little bit visible. Move it around, you can see on the other side it's still visible. And then you go in here. And I should actually, I should be tinning the pads and then going over again with desoldering braid, now that I think about it. I mean, this worked for this guy, but because there's so much corrosion going on here, I'm actually going to do that real quick, because that's going to tin these pads a lot better. It'll save time with resoldering the caps, but it's also just better for the health that you get the whole pad. Yeah, you see how nice that looks now? And I can, if I need to, I can use the desoldering braid to remove that fresh solder, but that way it's still tinning everything in a really nice way. And then you'll see a little bit of the flux come off from the new solder. That's totally fine. Like I said, flux isn't going to destroy your board. It's the acid that does it. And at this point, you can still get your iron pretty hot. If you want to, this is also a good time to reflow some of those resistors, which I might actually do for the ones down here. This one, this is actually the input cap that I'm doing on the corner here. And this one's a particularly nasty one. And it usually gets this row of resistors and capacitors gets a little nasty. You can kind of tell how fast the solder takes to it. Gives you some indication of how bad the acid is on there. Solder's taken to this pretty fast, so I think it's mostly all right. Still trying to do this on camera, but it's tricky because I'm having to hunch over here. But yeah, solder's taken to that pretty good. That's a good sign. That's a good sign. Because, the acid will do all kinds of weird stuff. It'll corrode, under the part. only on one side, you know, all just depends on how it leaked in there. All right. So now we can do some of these hundreds here. And I actually don't think I'll need to use the braid to remove. I think it's still pretty flat, at least on this one. The Z height is not as bad as it would be in a modern console. You know what? I'm gonna have to eat my words there. Actually, I'm gonna have to remove it. It's giving me a little bit of trouble. If it's not flat, then the you know, there'll be kind of a bubble underneath the capacitor. It won't sit perfectly flush, and it makes your life a little harder than it needs to be. So I'm just going through here with the braid again. I'm removing the new solder, but it doesn't remove it completely. Like I said, it's still tinning the pad, which is the reason why we did that. And you can see how nice and shiny those pads are. And that's not shiny just because there's alcohol on there. It's shiny because it's a fresh, clean pad now. So yeah, like I was saying, this is a multi-step process. This is not a 5 or 10 minute repair. I've been on camera here, according to my camera, for 20 minutes. I'm not done. All right, so now we just do one side, the negative rail there, and place our cap. I'm actually going to have to take off my gloves for this part. This is a little tricky with the gloves on. Working with capacitors. Since I'm going this far in, I might as well do the whole job on camera here so you get an idea of how much time this takes. By the way, if anybody knows a good camera editing software that's really easy to do batch editing for, well, in general, but also for speeding up stuff, I'd love to speed up some of these segments for people so they don't have to sit through in real time. But I'm not about to spend hours in Adobe Premiere doing that. That is way too time intensive for no money. If anybody wants to show me or tell me of a cool program that will batch edit, you know, like 2x speed or whatever for some of these videos, that would be cool. That would benefit everybody else, of course, as is the point of making these videos. Try to help people out. And so there we go. Another 100 microfarads. Some of this might have to be off camera because it's hard to reach in here under the this camera setup I got going on. I just find using my hands is usually a lot easier for these capacitors than tweezers. Sometimes, not always, but ideally I'd also have like a board grip setup so the board wouldn't move while I'm working on it. Also going to increase the temperature for my pencil tip iron's a little bit low. I'm going to increase it to 730 so I can heat up these pads a little more quickly. It's a good sign that the iron has to get hotter. I mean, that means the pad's it's absorbing the heat, which is what we want. That's what a good pad is doing, is it's absorbing the heat because it's connecting to a larger copper plane to transfer the signal. If a pad heats up too quickly or heats up very easily, and especially if it's connected to a large copper plane, that's a sign that it's been damaged because the heat's not being dispersed effectively. And just trying to get this aligned a little better. I guess if you had all the time in the world, you could take all the parts off, make a solder paste stencil, and then reflow it like a factory. That'd be cool. But a little too time intensive. That's, it's always the drawback with this kind of work is, I mean, that's probably overkill as well, but the, living in a capitalist system, you gotta figure out what is going to be efficient with the time. You want to do quality work, you want to be efficient with the time, and all my stuff is a little more premium because I do always strive to do really high quality work like this. And it definitely costs me because, people want to save money, understandably so. They want to pay for things, keep things really affordable and cheap. But, it's also that old thing where you get what you pay for. If you pay for a $50, $30 recapped Game Gear, it's not going to last 15 years. Maybe they'll be around in 15 years. I don't know. Maybe you can buy another one. I'm not counting on it. These things are already 30 years old. And who knows, too, the repair might be too hard to do at that point. It might become even more expensive. Especially if you have to rebuild traces. Nice thing about these boards, though, is they're not too complicated. Go ahead and try to focus my camera a little bit better on these guys. Maybe that's all the focus I can get at this distance. That's a bummer. But, yeah. You also get the peace of mind of just knowing once you do a job right, you don't have to do it again. Nothing's worse than when you do a repair or an upgrade and it comes back to you and you have to do some fix or some change. Extremely rare with the work that I do, which is very nice. But I know other people that have had to deal with it a lot, and it's unpleasant, to say the least. So now we have the very last capacitor here. The last little 47 microfarad. One of these days I do kind of want to re-engineer this soundboard and put in a better amp. But the Game Gear sound is not amazing, and there's not a lot of development for writing tunes for it, although I know one person that does write some pretty good tunes for it. And this amp, while it is old and kind of fuzzy, it's like the noise floor is quite high. It does the job fairly well. I do speaker upgrades for people, and that seems to help a lot. But the amp itself, I'm sure it could be improved. I should give it a shot at some point. Now you'll see this will happen sometimes. You'll get a little bit of solder on the side of the cap. That's not good. You have to do something about that because, especially if it gets on both sides, you're actually shorting the connection. You don't want that. That's really bad. So one thing about these exposed capacitors, they're meant to be installed in a factory where you're not going to have anything like that even be possible. When you're doing this by hand, little things can happen, and these capacitor, the outside of them are not actually insulated, of course. It's exposed metal, so you got to be a little mindful of that. All right, so feeling pretty good about that. All the capacitors are on there. I'm going to go ahead and take another board just to always double check your polarities. So that one looks correct, that one looks correct, that one looks correct, that one looks correct, and that one looks correct. Double, triple check your capacitor polarities. Always. Now, I do need to do a little bit, this one's not too bad, but I need to do a little bit of reflowing on the bottom. I have to keep my iron a little bit higher, a little bit lower for this. For the chip itself, you can have it be higher. That's not a big deal. And as we can see here, this one is taking to the solder very quickly. You're not seeing those crazy fumes Not as much of them. That's a really good sign. That means the acid didn't get too far in here. Now I'm going to lower the temperature a little bit and go for the one around those jacks. And sometimes you do have to look at the volume knob as well, and the headphone jack. The headphone jack I might actually do. This jack, of course, is the most important one. Oof. You'll hear that kind of like bubbling sound. That is usually the jack not responding well to the temperature, so you got to really lower the temperature a lot. Might actually go to the pencil tip iron for this. You got to be very quick with this. Some of it might actually be the acid burning off too, a little bit. So I saw some of the bubbling on the solder itself, not on the plastic. Be careful you don't bridge stuff, of course. That looks pretty good. I think the headphone jack's fine. Headphone jack, don't forget though, it does get a lot of mechanical wear over the years. You know, people bending the headphones or pulling on them or whatever. It really doesn't hurt to reflow things, you know, once every 30 years. It's amazing electronics last as long